Aurelia Sterling, a florist who spoke the language of petals and thorns, believed her world was limited to the fragrant walls of her small shop. She never imagined that the man who would walk through her door, a man of steel and silence named Damian Creed, would not only be looking for flowers but for a bride. If you believe in a chemistry so powerful that it can rewrite any contract, subscribe to this channel and tell me what country you're watching from today. I love seeing how far these stories travel. It all started on a gray and ordinary Tuesday. The kind of day that promises nothing, and therefore holds the potential for everything. It began, like most life-changing moments, with the sound of a small bell. The bell above the door of the Gilded Stem chimed, a delicate silver sound that was instantly swallowed by the sheer presence of the man who stepped inside. Damian Creed didn't just enter a room, he displaced the air within it. He brought the city in with him, the clean, cold scent of rain on concrete, the faint, sharp smell of expensive wool, and an aura of silence that was more profound than any noise. His world was one of 90-degree angles, of polished chrome and smoked glass, of numbers on a screen that dictated the rise and fall of empires. His world was monochromatic, intentional, and utterly, impeccably under his control. This place was the antithesis of his entire existence. It was a riot of color, a symphony of scent, an explosion of life in its most untamed form. And it was, for a reason his logical mind couldn't immediately compute, intoxicating. But it wasn't the flowers that held his attention. It was her. Aurelia Sterling. She stood behind a heavy oak work table, her back partially to him. She wasn't arranged in a pose of delicate beauty. She was working. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, revealing forearms dusted with a fine green pollen. Her hair, the color of warm honey, was swept up in a messy knot from which a few rebellious strands escaped, catching the light like spun gold. Her hands, they were the first thing he truly saw. They were not the hands of the women in his world, manicured, ornamental, and untouched. Her hands were capable. They moved with a focused, unhurried grace, stripping thorns from a rose stem with a practiced efficiency that was both gentle and ruthless. There was a small smudge of dirt on her cheek, and she was humming, a low, contented sound that seemed to weave itself into the fragrant air. He had come for a simple purpose. A business transaction. His executive assistant had failed to procure the floral arrangements for the annual Creed Foundation Gala, an unforgivable oversight. In a rare moment of impulse, driven by an irritation he couldn't explain, Damian had decided to handle it himself. He had chosen the nearest florist to his office with a respectable name. He had expected to be in and out in under 3 minutes. He stood there for a full 30 seconds simply watching. An eternity in his world. Finally she seemed to sense him. She didn't startle. She simply finished her task, placing the now perfect rose into a vase, and then turned. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rainstorm, met his. And for the first time in a decade, Damian Creed felt something he couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't desire, not in the simple, primal way he understood it. It was recognition. A jolt to the system. The silent hum of 2 power sources suddenly brought into close proximity. "Can I help you?" Her voice was like her work, clear, calm, with an underlying warmth. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the small shop. "I need floral arrangements. For an event." His own voice sounded clipped, sterile. The language of his world. She smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips that made the smudge of dirt on her cheek seem utterly charming. "You've come to the right place. What kind of event?" She moved from behind the table and the air shifted again. A new scent reached him. Not just the flowers but her. Something uniquely her own. Faint notes of freesia, perhaps from a lotion, mingled with the green, earthy scent of her work. It was clean. It was real. His mind, which cataloged data with ruthless efficiency, filed the scent away in a new, unnamed folder. "A corporate gala," he said, his eyes following her movement as she picked up a small leather-bound notebook. Minimalist. Elegant. White. She paused, her pen hovering over the page. She looked at him, truly looked, and her gaze was analytical, artistic. "White can be many things," she said softly. "It can be cold like a statue. Or it can be warm like cream. It can be innocent like a lily of the valley, or it can be sensual like a gardenia at midnight. What story are you trying to tell?" No one had ever asked him what story he was trying to tell. They asked for his projections, his orders, his signature on a bottom line. The question disarmed him. "The story," he said, the word feeling foreign on his tongue, "is one of power. Of success." Aurelia's gaze drifted around her shop, at the wild, beautiful chaos of it all. Then her eyes landed back on him and there was a flicker of something in them, amusement perhaps. Power isn't always loud, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Sometimes the most powerful things are the quietest. She walked over to a cluster of white orchids, their petals pristine and architectural. She touched one, a feather-light caress of her fingertip. An orchid doesn't shout. It simply draws you in. You can't ignore it. Her eyes met his over the bloom. Is that the kind of power you mean? His own pulse, a traitor in his wrist, gave a single hard beat. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to see that same fingertip trace a line over his own skin. He clenched his hands into fists in the pockets of his tailored coat. Control. It was the currency of his life. Yes, he managed to say, his voice a fraction deeper than before. That kind. For the next 10 minutes she moved through the shop, pulling together a vision in white and green. She worked with an innate understanding of texture and form, pairing the sharp lines of calla lilies with the soft cloud of baby's breath, the heavy heads of hydrangeas with the delicate spray of jasmine. He didn't speak. He watched. He watched the way the muscles in her back shifted under her simple cotton shirt. He watched the way she bit her lower lip in concentration, a gesture so unguarded it felt like a secret he had stumbled upon. He watched as she accidentally brushed her hand against a gardenia, and then, without thinking, brought her fingers to her nose, inhaling her own scent. The act was so private, so unconsciously sensual, that he felt like a voyeur. He felt a tightening in his chest. This was inefficient. This was a waste of his valuable time. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to leave. As she was writing down the final details, her phone, lying on the counter, buzzed. She glanced at it, and for the first time, the calm serenity in her expression faltered. A small line appeared between her brows. She ignored the call, but a moment later it buzzed again. "Excuse me for one moment," she said, her voice a little tighter. She answered, turning away from him to create a sliver of privacy. "I know," she said, her voice low. "I told you I'll have it by the 1st. Yes, I know that's next week. No business it's fine. I just need a little more time." There was a pause. "I understand. Thank you." She hung up and for a beat she didn't move. She stood with her back to him, her shoulders a little less straight than before. When she turned back, the professional smile was back in place, but he could see the shadow in her eyes. He had built his empire on seeing the cracks in the foundations of others. And he saw one now. An idea began to form in his mind. It was audacious, illogical, reckless, and yet it felt perfect. He had a problem. He needed a fiancée. A woman of grace, elegance, and unimpeachable character to satisfy the archaic terms of his family's trust. A woman who would be convincing, yet demand nothing of him emotionally. He had tasked his legal team with creating a shortlist, a portfolio of suitable candidates. It felt like acquiring a subsidiary. She had a problem. He could hear it in the strained politeness of her phone call. The quiet desperation of a small business owner trying to stay afloat. He saw the solution standing right in front of him, smelling of rain and gardenias. "Everything all right, Miss Sterling?" he asked, his tone smooth neutral. She lifted her chin, a gesture of pride that he found himself admiring. "Perfectly. Now about your delivery?" "I have a proposition for you," he said, cutting her off. The words hung in the fragrant air, dense and heavy. She blinked. "A proposition? I thought we'd settled on orchids." "A different kind of proposition. A business arrangement." He took a step closer. The space between them shrank and the air grew thick with unspoken things. He could see the faint, rapid pulse at the base of her throat. "I find myself in need of a fiancé." Aurelia stared at him. For a moment she looked as if he'd started speaking in a foreign language. Then a slow blush crept up her neck, a beautiful, infuriating sign of her transparency. And then she laughed. It wasn't a giggle. It was a genuine, throaty laugh of disbelief. "A fiancé? You walked into my flower shop to, what? Hire a fiancé." "I walked in to solve a problem," he corrected, his voice low and steady, his gaze unwavering. "And I discovered the solution to another." Her laughter died, replaced by a wary stillness. "I think you have the wrong impression of me, Mr. Creed. Damian Creed." He let his name settle in the space between them. He saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes. The name carried weight. It meant power. It meant money. "Mr. Creed," she said, her voice now cool, guarded. "My shop may be called the Gilded Stem, but I assure you nothing inside it is for sale. Especially not me." "I'm not asking to buy you, Miss Sterling," he said, taking another, deliberate step. He was inside her personal space now. He could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. He could smell the lingering scent of jasmine on her fingers. "I'm offering a partnership. A contract. 6 months of your time. You would play the part of my devoted fiancé. In return, your financial problems, the ones you just discussed on the phone, would cease to exist. I would not just save your shop. I would make it thrive." Her breath hitched. He saw the flash of war in her eyes, the insult warring with the temptation, the pride warring with the desperation. "Why?" she whispered, her gaze locked on his. "Why me?" He could have given her the logical answer. "Because you are elegant. Because you are believable. Because you are unlikely to cause complications." But his mind, for once, supplied the truth. And the truth, raw and unfiltered, slipped from his lips before he could stop it. "Because," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur that was meant for her alone, "when you looked at me and asked what story I was trying to tell, you were the first person in a very long time who didn't just see my net worth." The air crackled. The scent of the flowers around them seemed to intensify, to wrap around them like a shroud. This was no longer a business transaction. It had become something else. Something far more dangerous. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek, black business card. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he reached past her and placed it on the oak table, directly onto a bed of soft, green moss she had been using for another arrangement. The stark black rectangle against the living green. His world laid upon hers. "Think about it," he said softly. "You have my number. I'll take care of the invoice for the orchids." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her standing in a swirl of confusion and the intoxicating scent of flowers. The bell chimed his exit, the sound echoing in the sudden, profound silence. Aurelia stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her gaze fell to the card on the moss. Damian Creed. The name felt like a brand. An impossible choice. A temptation. A contract had been offered. Not one of ink and paper, but of whispered words and unspoken desires. What does a woman with a world of beauty to protect do, when the devil offers her a taste of a gilded heaven? The answer she would soon find was far more complicated than a simple yes or no. Night had fallen, but Aurelia hadn't moved. The vibrant sense of the day had softened into something deeper, more mysterious in the dark. The sweet perfume of the lilies seemed heavier, the earthy smell of the moss richer. The shop, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. A beautiful, fragrant cage whose bars were closing in. Damian Creed's presence lingered long after he was gone. It was in the faint, clean scent of his cologne that had somehow imprinted itself on the air. It was in the impossible weight of the small black card that sat on her work table. It was a tangible piece of his world, an alien artifact in hers. Her mind was a battlefield. One side, the side of her pride, of her grandmother's legacy, screamed betrayal. It called the proposition what it was, a grotesque transaction. To pretend to love a man for money, a man who was the personification of everything she quietly resisted. A man of cold calculation, of acquisitions and demolitions. But the other side of her mind, the pragmatic, desperate side, was quieter, more insidious. It whispered of the letters tucked away in her desk drawer. The ones with red ink and bold, capitalized words like final notice and eviction. It whispered of the sleepless nights spent juggling numbers that never added up. It reminded her of the strained phone call from earlier, the polite but firm voice on the other end explaining that sentiment didn't pay the rent. Her dream, the gilded stem, was dying. Slowly, quietly, petal by petal. She was pouring her soul into a vessel full of holes and she was drowning. Damian's offer wasn't a life raft. It was a luxury yacht. 6 months. He had said 6 months. Enough time to not just save the shop, but to secure its future for years. Enough to finally breathe. But it was the why. Why me? His answer echoed in her mind, unsettling her more than the proposal itself. Because you were the first person in a very long time who didn't just see my net worth. He hadn't seen her as an asset. He had seen her. The thought sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. In that moment he hadn't been a client or a predator. He had been a man. A man with a strange, unexpected vulnerability in his eyes. A man who, for all his power, seemed profoundly alone. And that, she realized with a jolt, was the most dangerous thing of all. With a hand that trembled slightly, she picked up her phone. She stared at the black card, at the clean silver font spelling out his name. Each number seemed to mock her. She could throw the card away, bury herself in her work, and watch her world crumble with her dignity intact. Or she could make a call that would change everything. Her finger hovered over the screen. She closed her eyes and an image flashed in her mind, the look on her grandmother's face the day they'd opened the shop, the pride in her eyes, the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. That memory was the final push. Her dignity was worthless if it meant letting that memory turn to dust. She pressed the call button. It rang only once. Creed? His voice came through the line, a low, smooth baritone. No preamble. No hesitation. As if he had been expecting her call. Her own voice was surprisingly steady. Aurelia Sterling. We spoke earlier. I know who you are, Miss Sterling. There was a pause, and she could almost hear the quiet confidence on the other end. Have you considered my proposition? I have, she said, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone. But if we're going to discuss this further, it won't be over the phone. And it won't be in my shop or your office. Neutral ground. She was drawing a line, asserting a boundary. She needed to feel like she had some semblance of control. There was another beat of silence. She imagined she had surprised him. He was a man who dictated terms, not one who accepted them. Then she heard what sounded like a faint, humorless smile in his voice. Very well. The Elysian Hotel. The lounge in the penthouse. 1 hour. I trust that is neutral enough for you? I'll be there, she said, and ended the call before he could, cutting the connection. It was a small victory, but it was hers. She stared at her reflection in the dark glass of the shop window. The woman staring back at her looked pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and resolve. She was about to make a deal with the devil. She just hoped she wouldn't have to sell her soul. The lounge at the Elysian was a world away from the Gilded Stem. It was a masterpiece of hushed luxury and understated power. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a city glittering like a carpet of scattered diamonds. The air was scented with expensive leather and the faint, clean aroma of gin. The quiet murmur of conversation was the only sound, a place where billion-dollar deals were likely made with a simple nod. He was already there, in a secluded booth in the corner, a single glass of amber liquid on the table in front of him. He rose as she approached, a gesture of old-world courtesy that seemed at odds with the ruthlessness of his proposition. He was no longer wearing the heavy wool coat. He was in a perfectly tailored dark suit, the white of his shirt a stark contrast against the tan column of his throat. He looked less like a businessman and more like a predator in its natural habitat, sleek, powerful, and perfectly at ease. Miss Sterling, he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to cut through the quiet hum of the room. Thank you for coming. Mr. Creed. She slid into the booth, placing her small purse on the leather seat beside her. She needed the barrier. She felt exposed under his intense, analytical gaze. It felt as if he could see right through her simple dress, through her skin, and into the frantic beating of her heart. A waiter appeared as if from nowhere. Can I get you something? Damien asked her, his eyes never leaving hers. Just water, she said. Her throat was too dry for anything else. Once the waiter had gone, a thick silence descended. Damien swirled the liquid in his glass, the ice cubes clinking softly. The sound was methodical, controlled. Like him. You said you've considered my offer, he began, getting straight to the point. I have, she confirmed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. And I have terms of my own. A single dark eyebrow arched in amusement. Oh? I was under the impression I was the one making the offer. You are offering the money, she countered, her voice gaining strength. I am offering my life. My reputation. My time. That makes me a partner in this arrangement, not an employee. And partners have terms. He leaned back, a genuine spark of interest in his eyes. He seemed more intrigued than offended. Go on. First, she said, leaning forward slightly, claiming her space. This is a performance. When we are in public, I will be whatever you need me to be. The loving fiancé. The adoring partner. But in private, when the curtain is down, we are strangers. There will be no expectations. I can assure you, he said, his voice a low purr that sent a shiver down her spine, my expectations are purely professional. But his eyes, as they dropped for a fraction of a second to her lips, told a different story. Second, she pressed on, ignoring the heat rising in her cheeks. My shop. It remains mine. You can be a silent investor, a benefactor, whatever title you want to give your money. But the decisions, the art, the soul of it, that remains mine. Agreed, he said without hesitation. I have no interest in the flower business. And third, she took a deep breath. There will be a contract. A real one. Not just your word. Outlining everything. The duration, the payment schedule, and a non-disclosure agreement for us both. But most importantly, a clause of termination. If at any point I feel unsafe or you violate the terms of our private arrangement, I can walk away. With a portion of the fee, but I can walk away. No questions asked. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. She felt her courage begin to waver. She had overplayed her hand. He was Damien Creed. He could find 100 other women willing to do this with no questions asked. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a slim leather folder. He slid it across the smooth, dark wood of the table. It's already been drafted, he said simply. My lawyers are thorough. It contains everything you just mentioned, including the termination clause. I believe you'll find the terms generous. She was stunned into silence. He had anticipated her. He had known she would demand these things. He had seen her pride, her fierce independence in the shop, and he had already factored it into his equation. The realization was both terrifying and, in a strange way, flattering. He hadn't underestimated her. She opened the folder. It was exactly as he'd said. Pages of dense, legal text, but the key points were clear. The sum of money he was offering made her head spin. It wasn't just enough to save her shop. It was enough to change her life completely. 6 months. 183 days of a lie in exchange for a lifetime of freedom. She read the clause about public appearances. The parties will be expected to display a convincing level of affection, including but not limited to holding hands, terms of endearment, and occasional chaste kisses. Her breath caught in her throat. A chaste kiss. The word seemed absurd when applied to the man sitting opposite her. She imagined his lips on hers, and there was nothing chaste about the image. It was fire and possession. She looked up, and he was watching her, his expression intense, as if he knew exactly what she had just read, what she was thinking. Is there a problem, Aurelia? He asked, and the sound of her first name, spoken in his deep voice for the first time, was a shocking intimacy. It slid over her skin like a touch. That's the name, she stammered, pointing to the document. It uses my first name. It's a contract between us, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. It would be impractical to keep calling you Miss Sterling, don't you think? You may call me Damien. Aurelia. Damien. Their names bound together in legal ink. She turned to the last page. There was a line for her signature and one for his. His was already there. A bold, sharp, and utterly confident scrawl of black ink. He produced a pen from his pocket. A heavy, expensive fountain pen. He didn't offer it to her but placed it on the folder. The choice was still hers. She looked from the contract to his face. The calculated charm was gone. What remained was a stark, powerful intensity. A silent demand. He wasn't just asking her to sign a paper. He was asking her to step into his world. She thought of the eviction notice one last time. She thought of her grandmother's hands covered in soil. She thought of the future she was about to sacrifice, and the one she was about to buy. She picked up the pen. It felt heavy, cold, and final in her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings. This was it. The point of no return. Her signature was a mirror of her feelings, not the bold slash of his, but a delicate, trembling script. As the last loop of the G in Sterling was completed, she felt a profound shift in the universe. The deal was done. She slid the folder back to him. He didn't look at it. His eyes were fixed on her. Welcome to the firm, partner, he said, and there was a dark, possessive satisfaction in his tone that made the hairs on her arms stand up. He reached across the table, not to shake her hand but with an open palm. Confused, she looked down. Your phone, he said. Hesitantly, she placed it in his hand. His fingers were warm, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. She watched as he deftly navigated the screen, adding his number not as Damien Creed, but simply as Damien. He then called his own phone, letting it ring once before hanging up. Now I have your number, he said, placing her phone back on the table. I'll be in touch to arrange for a wardrobe fitting. Our first official appearance is the gala. It's in 4 days. 4 days. She had 4 days to become another person. And Aurelia, he said, leaning forward again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Our story begins now. From this moment on, should anyone ask, we met a month ago. A chance encounter. A whirlwind romance. We are madly in love. He reached across the table and for the first time he touched her. He didn't take her hand. He simply laid his fingers over hers, which were still resting on the table. His touch was not forceful but it was absolute. A brand. A claim. The warmth of his skin seeped into hers, a heat that spread up her arm and settled deep in her chest. "Let the performance," he murmured, his gaze holding hers captive, "begin." And just like that the contract was sealed. Not with ink but with a touch. She had sold 6 months of her life. But as she felt the heat of his skin against hers, a terrifying thought crossed Aurelia's mind. What if, in the end, it was her heart that paid the price? The morning after is a peculiar thing. For Aurelia, it was as if the world had been repainted overnight in colors she didn't recognize. The sun was the same, the coffee smelled the same, but the foundation of her reality had shifted. She was no longer just Aurelia Sterling, florist. She was Aurelia Sterling, fiancée for hire to Damian Creed. The thought was so absurd, so monumental, that it felt like a dream she was trying to shake off. Then her phone buzzed, the sound sharp and intrusive in the morning quiet. A text message. From him. "Damian, a car will be waiting for you at 10 a.m. We have an appointment." There was no greeting, no closing. It was a directive. A summons. It was a stark reminder of what this was. A job. Her new boss was calling. She felt a flash of resentment, quickly followed by a jolt of nervous energy. The performance, it seemed, had already begun. The car that arrived was, of course, black, silent, and impossibly sleek. It whispered to a stop outside her modest apartment building, its tinted windows reflecting her own world back at her like a dark mirror. As she stepped inside, the door closing with a solid, satisfying thud, she was enveloped in his world. The scent of rich leather, the profound silence, the feeling of being insulated from the noise and chaos of the outside world. It was a cocoon of power, and for a terrifying moment, it felt good. They drove to a part of the city she only ever passed through, a street lined with discreet, elegant storefronts whose names were spoken in reverent whispers. The car pulled into a private underground entrance, and a valet opened her door. Damian was waiting for her inside. The space was not a store. It was a private showroom, a vast, minimalist gallery of clothing. Racks of silks and cashmeres in a muted palette of creams, grays and blacks lined the walls. It was beautiful, sterile, and intimidating. "Aurelia," he said, his voice a low anchor in the quiet room. He looked different. He was dressed more casually, in dark trousers and a soft, gray cashmere sweater that made his shoulders seem even broader. Without the armor of his suit, he seemed both more approachable and infinitely more dangerous. "Damian," she replied, testing his name on her tongue for the first time in his presence. It felt heavy, forbidden. A woman with a chic, severe haircut and a measuring tape draped around her neck glided towards them. "Mr. Creed. Everything is ready." "Aurelia, this is Madame Dubois," Damian said. "She will be helping you select a wardrobe for the next 6 months. A wardrobe for a life that wasn't hers." Aurelia felt a pang of dislocation. She looked down at her own clothes, a simple floral dress and worn denim jacket. They were a part of her, an extension of her soul. Here they felt like a costume from another play. "We begin with the gala," Madame Dubois announced, her French accent making the words sound like a decree. "I have pulled a few selections." What followed was a blur. Aurelia was led into a fitting room larger than her own living room, with 3-way mirrors and lighting that seemed to erase all flaws. She was zipped, pinned, and draped in fabrics that felt like water against her skin. There was a cream-colored sheath that was impossibly elegant, a black gown that was devastatingly simple. They were all beautiful. They were all masked. Damian sat in a plush armchair in the main showroom, occasionally glancing at a tablet, but she could feel his eyes on her every time she stepped out. He didn't speak, but his stillness was a form of commentary. He would give a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Madame Dubois, or a faint, dismissive shake of his head. He was the director, the curator of his perfect fiancée. "Try the last one," he finally said, his voice cutting through the air as she was about to retreat back into the fitting room. "The emerald." Madame Dubois brought it in. It was different from the others. Not black, not white, not a safe neutral. It was the color of deep moss after a rain, the color of a forest at dusk. It was the color of her eyes. The silk was heavy, cool, and it flowed over her body not like a dress, but like a second skin. It had a simple neckline that showcased her collarbones and a dangerously low back. When she stepped out, the room went silent. She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was not the florist. This woman was poise, elegance, and a mystery. The color made her skin glow, her hair seem richer, her eyes, deeper. And then she saw him. He was no longer looking at his tablet. He had stood up and was standing a few feet behind her. His gaze was fixed on her reflection in the mirror. And for the first time she saw a crack in the icy facade of Damian Creed. His control, his legendary composure had faltered. His eyes were dark, intense, and they weren't looking at the fiancée he was creating. They were looking at a woman. The look was so raw, so possessive, it sent a shockwave of heat through her entire body. Her breath caught. The pulse at the base of her throat began to beat a frantic rhythm. He moved closer, his steps silent on the thick carpet, until he was standing directly behind her. The heat of his body was a tangible presence at her back. He didn't touch her, but she could feel him in every nerve ending. The air between them was electric, thick with unspoken words. "This one," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur meant only for her. His gaze met hers in the mirror, and the world seemed to shrink to the space of that reflection. It was a strangely intimate bubble, the two of them surrounded by their own images. He lifted his hand, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought he was going to touch the bare skin of her back. She saw his fingers flex, saw the battle in his eyes. You wanted to. The desire was a raw, naked thing reflected back at them both. She saw her own lips part in the mirror, a silent invitation. A silent surrender. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. Then, with a visible clenching of his jaw, he lowered his hand. He took a small step back, breaking the spell. The air rushed back into her lungs, leaving her dizzy. "We'll take it," he said to Madame Dubois, his voice once again cool, controlled, the mask firmly back in place. "And everything else she requires." He turned to Aurelia, avoiding her eyes. "The car will take you home. I will see you at 7 p.m. on Saturday. We have things to discuss before the gala." And with that, he was gone, leaving her with a racing heart and the ghost of his touch on her skin. The next 2 days passed in a strange haze. Boxes arrived at her apartment, filled with clothes that felt like they belonged to someone else. Shoes she could never walk in, purses that cost more than her rent. She stayed in her shop, her hands buried in soil, seeking the comfort of the familiar. But even there his presence lingered. Every time the bell chimed, her heart would leap, half in fear, half in anticipation. Saturday evening arrived with a cold, steady rain that lashed against her windows. At precisely 6:30 her buzzer rang. It wasn't a car this time. It was him. She opened the door and he stood there, filling the hallway. He was dressed in another immaculate suit, holding a thin leather briefcase. The rain clung to his dark hair and the shoulders of his coat. He stepped inside and her small, cozy apartment seemed to shrink around him. His gaze swept the room, taking in the overflowing bookshelves, the mismatched furniture, the general, comfortable chaos of her life. It was so different from the sterile perfection of the showroom, from what she imagined his life to be. "You live here," he stated, not as a question but as an observation. There was an unreadable expression on his face. "Where did you think I lived?" she asked, a little defensively. "I didn't think," he admitted, his eyes landing on a framed photo of her and her grandmother, both covered in dirt and laughing. He looked at it for a moment too long. "We need to go over our story," he said, shifting back to business. He placed the briefcase on her small kitchen table and opened it. Inside wasn't a laptop or documents. It was a bottle of wine, an expensive-looking one, and 2 glasses. And a thin file. "I thought this might be more civilized," he said, producing a corkscrew from his coat pocket with a practiced ease. They sat at her table, the file between them as he poured the deep red wine. The file contained the script for their life. A detailed backstory of their fictional romance. It listed names of his family members, his business partners, his rivals. It was a dossier on his entire life. "Your grandmother, Elara," he said, reading from a page about her family. "She passed away 2 years ago. She's the one who taught you about flowers." Aurelia froze. "How did you know that?" It wasn't something she told him. "I believe in being thorough," he said simply, but his gaze softened for a fraction of a second. "It's a good foundation for our story. It's real." The fact that he had looked into her life, that he knew something so personal, was an invasion of privacy. But the way he said it, with a quiet respect, disarmed her. He talked her through the key players they would meet at the gala. His voice was a low, steady murmur, a stark contrast to the rain drumming against the window pane. As he spoke, she watched him. She saw the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he gestured with his hands to emphasize a point. She was learning the details of a lie, but she was also learning the details of the man. "And my cousin Julian," Damien was saying, "he will try to get under your skin. He is ambitious. Do not tell him anything real." "So I lie to everyone," she said, the words tasting bitter. "You and I don't lie to each other," he corrected, his voice quiet but firm. "That is the most important rule. Between us there are only the terms of the contract. To everyone else we are a story. Our story. He pushed a small velvet box across the table. It was black like his business card, like the cars. Her heart stopped. She knew what it was. This is part of the performance, he said, his voice neutral. It needs to be convincing. With trembling fingers she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a ring. It wasn't a massive, vulgar diamond like she might have expected. It was an antique ring, a stunning emerald, the exact shade as the dress, surrounded by a delicate halo of smaller diamonds on a platinum band. It was elegant. It was timeless. It was perfect. It looked like something she would have chosen for herself. How did you? She breathed, stunned. I paid attention, he said simply. At the shop. You were drawn to the things with history. With a story. He had paid attention. He had seen her. The thought sent a dangerous warmth spreading through her chest. He took the ring from the box. May I? She could only nod, her throat suddenly tight. She held out her left hand. His fingers were cool as they brushed against hers. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The weight of it was immediate. The cold, heavy reality of the lie. She stared at the jewel, sparkling under the warm light of her kitchen. It was a beautiful shackle. A gorgeous cage. She looked up at him and he was already watching her, his expression intense. The space between them at the small table felt charged, intimate. All the reasons, all the contracts, all the rules seemed to fade away, leaving only this. A man and a woman in a small, quiet room with the rain falling outside. A dress. A ring. A story. The pieces of the illusion were all in place. But as Aurelia looked at the man across the table, she realized the greatest danger wasn't in the lie they were about to tell the world. It was in the truth she was beginning to feel in her own heart. The performance was about to begin. The question was, would they both remember that it was just an act? The ride to the Creed Foundation Gala was a silent one. Not a comfortable silence, but a dense, charged vacuum filled with the things they weren't saying. Aurelia sat stiffly in the plush leather seat, the emerald silk of her dress cool against her skin. She felt like a doll, perfectly dressed and arranged for a party she had no business attending. The ring on her finger felt heavier with every passing mile, a beautiful, glittering lie. Damien sat beside her, a study in controlled stillness. He stared out the window, his jaw set, but she could feel the energy radiating from him. It was the taut energy of a predator before the hunt, of a general before a battle. Tonight, she was his secret weapon, and his most glaring vulnerability. Ready? He asked, his voice a low murmur. She took a shaky breath. No. A flicker of something, not annoyance but perhaps understanding, crossed his face. Just stay close to me, he said. And remember the story. The rest is just noise. He reached over, his hand hovering in the space between them. May I? She nodded, unsure of what he was asking. His hand moved to the nape of her neck, his fingers gently pushing aside a stray curl of her hair that had fallen from her elaborate updo. His touch was brief, feather-light, but it sent a bolt of pure heat straight down her spine. It wasn't a gesture for the cameras. It was for them. A silent message of something. Reassurance? Possession? She couldn't tell. Let's begin, he said. The moment the car door opened, the world exploded in a cacophony of flashing lights and shouted questions. The noise was a physical force pressing in on her. But Damien was a shield. He stepped out first, then turned and offered her his hand. His grip was firm, grounding. As he helped her out of the car, a collective gasp seemed to ripple through the press line. She was on stage now. She lifted her chin, just as she had done in her shop when he'd first challenged her. She smiled, not a wide, brittle smile but a small, secret one, aimed only at him. She saw a flicker of surprise, of genuine admiration, in his eyes before his public mask of cool indifference slid back into place. He placed her hand in the crook of his arm, his other hand coming to rest possessively on the small of her back, his fingers splayed against the bare skin exposed by the dress. The shock of his warm palm against her cool skin made her gasp audibly. It wasn't part of the contract, this casual, proprietary touch. It was an improvisation. And it felt more real than anything they had rehearsed. They walked the red carpet, a slow, deliberate procession through a sea of hungry eyes. His presence was a fortress. He moved through the chaos with an innate, unshakable confidence that she found herself borrowing from. He would lean down, whispering something in her ear, just a few more feet. You're doing perfectly, and she would laugh, the sound genuine, as if he'd just shared the most charming secret in the world. They were a portrait of new, intoxicating love, and she could feel the story solidifying around them, becoming real in the eyes of the hundreds of people watching. The ballroom was even more overwhelming. It was a cavern of glittering crystal and gold, with chandeliers that dripped light like frozen waterfalls. The air hummed with the murmur of 100 conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the swell of a string quartet. The scent of expensive perfume, decadent food, and money filled the air. This was his world. A jungle of silk and diamonds, where the predators smiled and circled, and she was the new, unknown creature on display. Damien. So the rumors are true. A man with a practiced smile and cold eyes approached them. Alistair, Damien greeted him, his tone smooth as glass. Aurelia, this is Alistair Finch, a business associate. Alistair, my fiancée, Aurelia Sterling. My fiancée. The words, spoken in his deep, confident voice, sent another strange tremor through her. A pleasure, Alistair said, his eyes raking over Aurelia with an appraiser's gaze. Sterling. I don't believe I know the Sterlings. She's not one of us, Damien said, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on her back. The statement was a clear warning. A line drawn in the sand. She's mine. She's off limits. They navigated the room, a slow, deliberate dance. Damien was a king in his court and she, his chosen queen. He introduced her to a blur of faces, his hand a constant, warm presence on her skin. With every introduction, every shared smile, every time he leaned in to whisper a name in her ear, the lie began to feel less like a lie and more like a different kind of truth. She was performing, yes, but the feelings, the nervous flutter in her stomach when he looked at her, the sense of safety in his grip, the thrill of their shared secret, were undeniably real. Then she saw him. The man Damien had warned her about. His cousin Julian. He was leaning against a marble pillar, a champagne flute held loosely in his hand. He was handsome in a way that was almost too perfect, like a statue. But his smile didn't reach his eyes, which were watching them with a sharp, reptilian stillness. As they drew closer, he pushed off the pillar and moved to intercept them. Cousin, Julian said, his voice a silky, dangerous drawl. I was beginning to think you'd never show. And you've brought a guest. His eyes landed on Aurelia and his smile widened, but it held no warmth. Julian, Damien's voice was a shade colder now. This is Aurelia. My fiancée. Julian's eyes widened in mock surprise. Fiancée? My word, Damien. You do work fast. It feels like only yesterday you were swearing off the fairer sex entirely. He turned his full attention to Aurelia. So, Aurelia. A florist, I hear? How utterly quaint. Tell me, where did a man like my cousin, who considers nature a hostile takeover of his concrete views, manage to stumble upon you? The question was a dart, aimed with precision. Aurelia felt Damien tense beside her, but she remembered his words. Our story. She smiled sweetly at Julian. Actually, he stumbled into my shop. He was looking for something powerful and quiet. Her eyes flicked to Damien, a shared, secret glance. He chose orchids. And me. Damien's fingers subtly stroked the skin of her back, a silent, well done. Julian's smile tightened. He wasn't giving up. A whirlwind romance, then. You must tell me everything. How long have you known each other? You must have swept her off her feet, Damien. She doesn't seem like the type to be easily impressed by a large bank account. It was an insult wrapped in a compliment, aimed at them both. Some things, Damien said, his voice low and final, are not for public consumption, Julian. Oh, but we're family, Julian pressed, taking a step closer to Aurelia. I'm just so curious about the woman who finally managed to tame the beast. He's never brought a woman to this event before, you know. You must be exceptionally special. His gaze dropped to the ring on her finger. Or exceptionally convincing. The final words were a whisper meant only for her to hear. A chill went through her. He knew. Or he suspected. The room suddenly felt too hot, the air too thin. The faces around her seemed to press in, their smiles turning into leers. She felt a wave of panic rise in her throat. This was a mistake. She couldn't do this. She wasn't an actress. She was a florist and she was completely, terrifyingly out of her depth. Before she could falter, Damien's hand moved from her back to her arm, his grip firm, proprietary. If you'll excuse us, Julian, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. My fiancée and I would like to dance. He didn't wait for a reply. He steered her away from his cousin, his body a solid barrier between her and the prying eyes of the crowd, and led her towards the center of the room where couples were swaying to the music. He pulled her into his arms, one hand finding its familiar place on her back, the other enveloping her hand. The world outside of his hold simply ceased to exist. It was just the music, the low light, and him. His scent, that clean, masculine scent of him, mixed with the faint smell of rain from earlier, filled her senses. "Breathe, Aurelia," he murmured into her hair. "He knows," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He suspects something. Julian suspects everyone of everything," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "It's his nature. Don't let him get to you." He pulled her a fraction of an inch closer, until there was no space left between their bodies. Her breasts were flush against the hard wall of his chest. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against hers, a stark contrast to her own frantic rhythm. "You handled him perfectly." "I was terrified," she confessed, the admission a raw, honest thing in the middle of their perfect lie. His thumb began to draw slow, soothing circles on the bare skin of her back. The simple, repetitive motion was hypnotizing, melting the tension from her spine. "I know," he said, and his voice was different, softer. "I saw. I won't let him or anyone else hurt you." The confession hung in the air between them. "I won't let them hurt you." It was a line no contract could ever require. It was a promise. It was the voice of a man, not an employer. She looked up at him, then really looked at him. The public mask was gone. His eyes, dark and turbulent, were fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath. She saw the admiration he'd shown her on the red carpet. She saw the protective anger he'd felt towards Julian. And she saw something else. Something deeper, more vulnerable. The same raw desire she'd seen in his reflection in the showroom mirror, but magnified, intensified by the public stage and the undeniable chemistry between them. The music swelled. The world around them faded to a blur. His gaze dropped to her lips. This was it. The moment she had seen in her mind's eye in her kitchen. The moment she had felt in the showroom. It was no longer a performance. It was no longer about the contract or the money. It was about the undeniable magnetic pull that had existed between them since the moment he'd first walked into her shop. He lowered his head, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. She couldn't. She rose on her toes, her free hand coming to rest on his shoulder, her fingers curling into the fine fabric of his suit jacket. Her lips parted in silent anticipation. The world held its breath. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a tentative exploration. When Damien's lips finally met hers, it was an answer. The kiss began with the terrifying precision of a man who always gets what he wants. It was firm, commanding, a seal placed upon her mouth that silenced the room, the music, and the doubts whispering in her mind. But then, something fractured. The cool, calculated performance he had undoubtedly planned disintegrated the moment he tasted her. She tasted of champagne and nerves, a sweetness that was entirely her own. And Aurelia, she didn't pull away. She didn't stiffen. She melted. Her hands, which had been resting lightly on his shoulders, slid upward, her fingers tangling into the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. It was an instinctual, ungovernable reaction. A low sound vibrated in his chest, a growl of approval that she felt against her own lips. He deepened the kiss, tilting her head back, his hand on her waist sliding up to grip her rib cage, his thumb pressing into the silk and the soft flesh beneath. It was no longer for the cameras. It was a hunger. A starvation he hadn't known he was enduring until this very moment. For 10 seconds, or perhaps 10 years, they existed only in that contact. The heat of his mouth, the roughness of his jaw grazing her soft skin, the scent of him filling her lungs. It was overwhelming, dizzying, and utterly devastatingly real. When he finally pulled back, it wasn't far. Just enough to breathe. His forehead rested against hers, his eyes dark and blown wide, searching hers. There was no triumph in his gaze, no satisfaction of a job well done. There was only a raw, stunned intensity. "Damien," she whispered, her voice wrecked, breathless. He didn't answer. He simply ran his thumb over her lower lip, tracing the redness he had put there. Around them applause broke out. A polite ripple of sound from the wealthy elite who saw only a romantic gesture. But Julian, out of the corner of her eye, Aurelia saw him. He wasn't clapping. He was watching them with a look of narrowed calculation, his glass raised in a silent, mocking toast. He had wanted proof. He had gotten it. But he had also seen something else. He had seen his cousin lose control. "We're leaving," Damien said, his voice rough. It wasn't a suggestion. He didn't let go of her hand as they walked out. His grip was tighter now, urgent. They moved through the crowd like a single entity, ignoring the calls of reporters, the flashes of cameras. They were fleeing the scene of a crime, the crime of falling in love when they had signed a contract to simply pretend. The drive back was different this time. The silence wasn't empty, it was heavy, charged with the electricity of what had just happened. Aurelia sat staring at her hands, at the emerald ring that now seemed to pulse with the same heat that throbbed in her veins. Her lips still tingled. Her skin still felt the imprint of his hands. He didn't take her home. When the car slowed, she looked out the window and realized they weren't on her quiet, tree-lined street. They were at the base of the Onyx Tower, the glass monolith where he lived. "Damien?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I'm not leaving you alone tonight," he said, staring straight ahead. "Not with Julian prowling around. Not after that." He didn't explain what that was. He didn't need to. The elevator ride to the penthouse was a study in tension. They stood apart, but the air between them crackled. Every time the car shifted, she felt the magnetic pull to step closer to him. He stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the numbers climbing on the display, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. The doors opened directly into his apartment. It was exactly as she had imagined, vast, beautiful, and cold. Walls of glass revealed the entire city spread out below like a circuit board. The floors were dark marble, the furniture low and modern Italian leather. It was a fortress of solitude. There were no flowers here. No mess. No life. Until she stepped inside. Her emerald dress was a slash of vibrant color against the monochrome room. Her scent, floral and warm, began to drift through the sterile air. "Drink?" he asked, walking to a built-in bar that looked like a chemistry lab. "Yes," she breathed. "Please." He poured 2 amber liquids. His hand, usually so steady, hesitated for a fraction of a second as he capped the bottle. He handed her the glass, their fingers brushing. The shock was immediate, a static snap that made them both recoil slightly. "That kiss," Aurelia started, the words tumbling out because she couldn't hold them back. "That wasn't in the script, Damien." He took a long swallow of his drink, turning to look out at the city. His back was to her, a wall of broad shoulders and tension. The script required a display of affection. "I gave them one." "Don't," she said, stepping closer. Anger flared in her chest, hot and sudden. "Don't lie to me. You said we wouldn't lie to each other. That wasn't a display. That was..." "What?" He turned around, his movement sudden, sharp. "What was it, Aurelia?" "It was real," she whispered, the confession hanging in the air between them. Damien set his glass down on a side table with a heavy thud. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just inches from her. The predator was back, but he wasn't hunting her. He was fighting himself. "It can't be real," he said, his voice low and harsh. "You are here because I paid you to be here. You are here because I needed a shield. Real is messy. Real is a liability. Real gets people hurt." "Is that what you tell yourself?" she challenged, looking up at him, refusing to back down. "To keep everyone out? To stay safe in your tower?" "I am not safe," he growled, and then his hands were on her. Not gently this time. He gripped her upper arms, pulling her to him. "Do you think I feel safe right now? With you looking at me like that? Smelling like rain and flowers and everything I've spent my life avoiding?" He stared down at her, his eyes searching her face, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her throat. "I wanted to kiss you," he confessed, the words torn from him. "Since the moment you stood in that fitting room. Since the moment you told me off in your shop. I wanted to know if you tasted as quiet and powerful as you looked. And," she breathed, her heart hammering against his chest. "And you tasted like ruin," he murmured. "My ruin." He lowered his head, and this time there was no hesitation, no audience. He kissed her again. If the first kiss was a statement, this one was a question asked by his tongue, his teeth, his breath against hers. "Can I have this? Can I take this?" It was messy. It was desperate. It was the collision of 2 worlds that had no business touching. Aurelia made a soft sound in her throat, dropping her glass onto the thick carpet. Thankfully it didn't break, so she could wrap her arms around his neck. She pulled him closer, needing to feel the solid weight of him, the reality of him. He groaned, a low, guttural sound, and lifted her. She wrapped her legs around his waist instinctively, and he carried her, not to the bedroom but to the nearest surface, the heavy, dark marble of his dining table. He set her down on the edge, stepping between her legs, pressing his hips against hers. The friction of the silk dress against his suit trousers was maddening. His hands roamed over her back, finding the zipper of the emerald dress. "This dress," he muttered against her neck, pressing a hot, open-mouthed kiss to the sensitive skin beneath her ear. "It's been driving me insane all night." "Take it off," she whispered. The command shocked her. She was Aurelia Sterling, the girl who pruned roses and drank tea. But with him she was someone else. Someone bolder. Someone who wanted. The sound of the zipper sliding down was loud in the quiet apartment. The cool air hit her heated skin, followed immediately by the scorching warmth of his hands spreading across her bare back. He pushed the silk off her shoulders, letting it pool at her waist. He pulled back to look at her. She was sitting on his table, half naked, her hair a mess, her lips swollen, wearing nothing but his ring and the ruins of a designer dress. Beautiful, he said, the word sounding like a prayer and a curse. You are so incredibly beautiful, Aurelia. He traced a scar on her shoulder, a small white line she'd gotten from a thorn years ago. This is real, he said, his voice filled with wonder. This is you. Damien, she said, placing her hands on his face, forcing him to look at her. I'm not just a contract. I'm not just a fix for your company. I'm here. I'm me. I know, he said, turning his face to kiss her palm. That's what terrifies me. He leaned in, kissing the hollow of her throat, his hands moving to the front of her dress, to the clasp of her bra. The anticipation was a physical ache. She arched her back, offering herself to him, wanting the barrier of clothes gone, wanting skin on skin. But then his phone rang. It was a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the haze of desire like a knife. Damien froze. His forehead rested against her chest, his breathing ragged. He didn't move to answer it. He just stayed there, fighting a silent battle. Ignore it, she whispered. I can't, he said, his voice thick with regret. He pulled back, his eyes almost black with frustration. It's the private line. Only 3 people have it. My lawyers. My head of security. And Julian. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the phone. He looked at the screen and his expression hardened. The lover vanished. The CEO returned. It's security, he said. He answered, putting it on speaker as he buttoned his jacket with one hand, turning slightly away from her, though he kept one hand on her knee, a silent apology. Creed, he barked. Mr. Creed, a voice crackled. We have a situation. Photos have leaked. Not from the gala. From before. Surveillance shots. Of you and Miss Sterling. Arguing. In the alley behind her shop. From the night you first met. The narrative is being challenged. Damien's hand tightened on her knee. Who released them? He demanded, his voice ice cold. Anonymous source. But the IP traces back to a shell company we know is linked to family interests. Julian. Damien hung up. He looked back at Aurelia. She was still sitting on the table, the dress pooling around her waist, but the magic of the moment was shattering under the cold light of reality. He's making his move, Damien said, his voice flat. He's trying to prove the relationship is fake by showing we were fighting when we supposedly met. He walked over to her, but instead of kissing her, he pulled the straps of her dress back up. His hands were gentle but efficient. He was dressing her. Covering her up. Closing the door he had just kicked open. We have to get ahead of this, he said, the business mask sliding back into place, though she could see the cracks in it. You need to stay here tonight. For appearances. But, this, he gestured between them, we have to stop. We can't afford to be distracted. If we slip up, if he proves this is a fraud, I lose the company. And you lose everything I promised you. Aurelia felt the cold seep back into her bones. A moment ago she was a woman being worshipped. Now she was a strategic asset being managed. So we just stop? She asked, her voice trembling. After what just happened? Damien looked at her, and the agony in his eyes was the only thing that kept her from crying. We have to, he said. For now. He turned and walked towards the window, looking out at the city he ruled, leaving her sitting on the marble table, feeling more naked in her dress than she had when she was out of it. They had surrendered to the fire, only to be doused by the cold water of their reality. The dress was back on. The walls were back up. But as Aurelia watched the man she was paid to love turn his back on her to save his empire, she realized the terrifying truth. The contract was the only thing keeping them together, and it was the very thing keeping them apart. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. It wasn't charged with desire anymore. It was a cold, brittle thing, filled with the ghosts of a passion that had been executed by logic. Aurelia looked at the man across the room, the man who had tasted like her ruin, and saw a king retreating back into his fortress, pulling up the drawbridge behind him. We have to stop. For now. The words echoed in her mind. For now. As if their connection was a faucet he could turn on and off at will. She wasn't a partner. She wasn't even a lover. She was a variable in his equation, a risk to be managed. A moment ago, under his touch, she had felt like the center of his universe. Now she was just a potential complication to his empire. And in that devastating clarity she found her strength. The same pride that had made her hesitate to accept his deal now demanded that she terminate it. Slowly, gracefully she slid off the table. She adjusted the emerald dress, pulling the fabric straight, smoothing away the wrinkles left by his hands. It was an act of reclaiming herself. Damien turned, sensing the shift in her. His face was a mask of conflict, his eyes pleading with her to understand. But she couldn't. "You're right," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, clear as a bell in the vast, silent room. "We do have to stop. Not for now. For good." "Aurelia, that's not what I meant," he started, taking a step towards her. "Julian is trying to destroy us. We have to present a united front." "No," she corrected him softly. "He is trying to destroy you. I am just the stage dressing." She looked down at her hands and began to slide the emerald ring off her finger. The metal was warm from her skin. "I can't do this, Damien. I thought I could be an actress. But my heart doesn't know how to pretend." The ring came free. She walked over to the marble table where she had sat, where he had almost undressed her, and placed the ring gently on the cold, dark surface. The green jewel glittered under the recessed lighting, a lonely, abandoned star. "The termination clause," she said, her gaze meeting his across the room. "I'm invoking it. Our contract is over." The color drained from his face. He looked from her to the ring, and it was as if he was only just now realizing the true cost of his strategic retreat. "You can't," he said, his voice raw. "Aurelia, please. Don't do this. I need you." "You need a fiancé," she said, the words aching in her chest. "You can buy another one. You paid me for a performance and I'm no longer willing to play the part. Especially when the feelings have become real. Because that wasn't in the contract." Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not in his world." "The story you wanted to tell was one of power," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "But the story we just started to live, it felt like something else entirely. And you just chose power over it. Over me." She turned and walked towards the elevator, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She didn't have her shoes, her purse. She had nothing but the dress on her back and the tatters of her heart. "Where are you going?" he called out, his voice laced with a desperation she had never heard before. "Home," she said without turning back. "To my world. The one with dirt and thorns and things that are real." She pressed the button and the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. She stepped inside and only then did she let the first tear fall. The doors closed and he was gone. Damien stood frozen in the center of his perfect, empty penthouse. The scent of her was still in the air. The ghost of her warmth was still on his skin. He looked at the ring on the table, a tiny, glittering accusation. He had won. He had seen Julian's attack and had immediately shifted to a defensive strategy. He had assessed the threat, managed his asset and prepared for corporate war. He had done what he had been trained to do his entire life. He had protected the empire. And in doing so he had raised the only beautiful thing in it. He walked to the table and picked up the ring. It was still warm. He closed his fist around it, the facets of the jewels digging into his palm. The pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache that was carving out his chest. He had told her that reality gets people hurt. He had been wrong. It was the lies that hurt. The contracts. The walls. He had built a fortress around his heart for so long, he hadn't realized that she hadn't breached the walls. She had simply walked through the front gate, which had been unlocked all along waiting for her. And he, the fool, had just thrown her out and locked it behind her. Julian's attack didn't matter. The board's approval didn't matter. The inheritance, the company, the entire Creed empire, it was all just a pile of cold, dead stone without her. She was the gilded stem. She was the life. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. The man staring back was the CEO, the titan, the winner. And he had never looked more defeated. He knew what he had to do. The performance wasn't over. It was time for the final act. But this time he wouldn't be playing a part. He would be telling the truth. All of it. Whatever the cost. The next morning Aurelia was in her shop. She had arrived before dawn, seeking solace in the familiar rituals of trimming stems and changing water. She had traded the emerald silk for her old, comfortable jeans and a soft sweater. She was trying to scrub the memory of him from her skin, but it was impossible. A small television she kept in the back office was on, the sound muted. A financial news network. Suddenly, a picture of Damien flashed on the screen. It was a photo from the gala, of him smiling down at her. Her heart seized. She reached for the remote and turned up the volume. Calling an emergency press conference at Creed Tower in response to rumors of instability in his personal life, which analysts say could affect the upcoming merger. She watched, mesmerized, as the live feed began. Damien walked to a podium facing a sea of reporters. He looked exhausted, but his eyes held a fire she had never seen before. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and steady, amplified through the speakers. "I've called you here today to address a story that has recently surfaced. A story built on leaked photographs and anonymous sources, designed to destabilize my company." Julian, she thought. He was going to deny it all. To spin another, better lie. "The story alleges that my relationship with my fiancée, Aurelia Sterling, is a fraud," Damien continued. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "And I am here today to tell you, that story is true." A collective gasp went through the press room. Aurelia's hands flew to her mouth. "The arrangement began as a business contract," Damien stated, his voice unwavering, brutally honest. "I needed a fiancée to secure my position within my family's trust. Miss Sterling, an honorable and brilliant woman running a small business, was under financial duress. I offered her a solution. A business proposition. It was a lie, constructed for the sole purpose of commerce and control. He was destroying himself. Publicly. Willingly. My cousin Julian Creed was right to be suspicious. He leaked those photos to expose a corporate sham." Damien's eyes found the camera, and it felt like he was looking right at her. But what he and I failed to account for was reality. "You see, I set out to buy a convincing performance. And instead, I fell in love with the performer." Aurelia was openly crying now, tears of shock and disbelief streaming down her face. "I fell in love with her strength," he said, his voice growing thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "I fell in love with her integrity, with the way she sees the world not as a balance sheet, but as something that grows, something that is real. I hid behind a contract because I was a coward, too afraid to feel anything genuine. And last night I made the worst trade of my life. I chose my company over her heart. And I lost both." He took a deep breath. "As of this morning, I have informed the board that I am prepared to relinquish my position as CEO and forfeit the controlling shares of the trust. The empire is meaningless to me without her. The lie is over." He looked directly into the camera one last time, his soul stripped bare for the world to see. "Aurelia," he said, and the name was a plea. "I know I don't deserve you. I know I broke the only rule that mattered, to be honest with you. But I am begging. Not for my company. Not for my reputation. I am begging for you. I love you. That is the only truth left." He turned and walked away from the podium, leaving behind a stunned silence and the explosion of 1,000 camera flashes. Aurelia stood frozen in her shop, her hand over her heart, which felt like it was about to beat out of her chest. 20 minutes later, the bell above her shop door chimed. He stood there, not in a suit but in a simple dark sweater and trousers. His hair was a mess. He looked like a man who had walked through fire. He looked real. "The contract is void," he said, his voice quiet, raw. "The money is already in your account. That was for your time. For the trouble. This is for me." He took a hesitant step into her world, into the fragrant, living air of her shop. "I have no proposition," he said, his eyes filled with a terrifying vulnerability. "I have no leverage. I have nothing to offer you but the truth. The man without the name. Without the empire. Would you be willing to teach me how to tell a different kind of story? A real one. With you." She didn't answer with words. She closed the distance between them, stepping through the fallen petals on the floor, and wrapped her arms around his neck. She pressed her face into the crook of his neck, inhaling his scent, the scent of him. "Yes," she whispered against his skin. "Yes." He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair, holding her as if she were the last real thing on earth. He wasn't the CEO. She wasn't the hired fiancée. They were just Damien and Aurelia. And their story was just beginning. Have you ever felt a connection like this? One that changes all the rules? One that makes you willing to risk it all? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of a love you never saw coming, press that subscribe button. There's a new romantic journey waiting for you here, every night. Thank you for watching, and may you find your own unexpected, beautiful, and very real love.